Working. All right, so good morning. Thanks for coming to this, the best day, in my opinion, of SBC workshop, consensus workshop. Today I will talk to you about POD, which is a paper that we worked on with my colleagues from Common Prefix, Orestis Alpos and Bernardo David, Bernie, which we called POD. So out of this also came a company that implemented it. But I also want to say that some of these things are still work in progress, so it's also a talk in which I want to solicit your opinion and further research on this, because we clearly, there's also a lot of things that we still don't know. So hopefully this will be kind of inspiration and food for thought. Okay, so POD is a latency optimal layer 1, that's the title. I don't think I can move here, right, so I have to kind of stay with the microphone, right? There's another, can I hold it? Yeah, can I hold the mic? Can I use this? Right, okay, yeah, that's fine. All right, so latency optimal layer 1. Okay, let's motivate this problem a little bit on how it came to be, how the thought came to be. So what inspired us to do this work is we were looking at kind of traditional Web 2 services that are offering services like payments, services like PayPal, let's say, for example, right? So in these services, what you have is you have, probably not visible, right? Okay, so you have a server in the middle, maybe it's like some sort of HTTP server, and then you have a couple of clients that want to interact, and you don't want them to interact directly. Maybe they don't even know each other, right? So you're using an intermediate server to help you out there. So that's a central party in all of this. And then there's a writer client on the one hand initiating some sort of transaction. That writer client pushes the transaction to the server, and then the server maintains some sort of log, as we know from the blockchain world, right? And then pushes that transaction to the reader client. And what I mean by reader and writer in the context, let's say, of payments, this could be, the writer could be a customer to a shop, and then the reader could be a vendor to a shop, right? So if this kind of setting is Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, right, this is kind of how we push these things, right? And then as soon as the reader receives this transaction from this trusted server, then the vendor can dispatch the product to the client, right? So you don't need to wait for blocks. You don't need to wait for any sort of confirmation, right? So that was kind of the inspiration for what we're going to do. And the nice thing about this picture is that it has optimal latency, right? So the writer to the server takes a delta time, and then the server to the client or the reader client takes another delta. That's a 2 delta. That's kind of your physical bound due to network connectivity, right? You cannot do better than that. And the question is, okay, can we replicate this in a sort of Byzantine setting or Web3 era setting, right? Blockchains. In blockchains, this is the picture that we have is very different from that, right? Like we wait for blocks, we wait for confirmations, and so on. So that's kind of the motivation, and the question is, what can we do in this model where we're measuring the latency from the moment that you're trying to initiate a transaction to the moment that you're confirming a transaction? Obviously, when we don't have a trusted third party, we may have faults. The simplest form of fault is a crash fault. And in a crash fault, well, one of the servers might die out. So definitely we need to replicate in this fashion, right? And in order to avoid having a crashing server, what we can do is we can have the client connect to multiple servers, push the transaction there, and those take the responsibility of sending things to the reader client. And even though we can have this kind of spread out of multiple replicas, you're still not losing anything on latency, right? So you're maintaining this optimal latency, which is kind of the desirable property. Now, of course, in the Web3 world, you don't just have crash faults, you have Byzantine faults. So you might have multiple replicas failing in malicious ways. And so now, let's say that we're still sending the transaction to everyone. Everybody's still sending the transaction to the reader. And, well, the question that we have here is, okay, you know, under the constraint of having optimal latency, what can we do? How much can we do with this thing, right? Okay, so here's some design principles that we started out with. The first one is this kind of optimal latency of 2 delta, matching the physical network. Then the second part is kind of related to the first, that we don't have replica-to-replica communication. The replicas don't talk to each other, because if they talk, then you're adding additional latency. Okay, so that's already should be a hint that this is going to be very different from a consensus protocol or a protocol like a blockchain, right? And then, of course, we want to be Byzantine resilient, because we're no longer in the Web 2 space, so we want better, stronger adversaries to be withstood. One of the other design principles we have in this paper is that the replicas are lazy, so they're responsible for helping you get the message across and authenticate somehow the message, but not really execute it. That's going to be something that we leave with the client. And then, in the spirit of maintaining optimal latency, we're going to follow this principle of a streaming fashion, right? So I'm pushing rather than pulling transactions. So as a customer, whenever I'm ready to make the transaction, I push it to the server pushes it to the reader, right? Here we want to do the same kind of thing. So it's a streaming thing. As soon as I have the data, I'm going to push it. Contrary to a blockchain like Ethereum or Bitcoin, let's say, examples, where you have blocks that are coming every interval, whether that's like proof of work based Poisson process or like a proof of stake slot based process where you have to wait for the blocks to accumulate transactions. So, it's going to be blockless and chainless. It's not going to have any of that. And then it's also going to be leaderless. And that's kind of going back to the idea that if I have crash faults and I have a leaderful protocol, then that would mean that I have to do some view change or leader rotation, which would induce additional latency. So what I'm doing is I'm basically paying for this by connecting to everybody, and then hoping that if somebody dies here, the rest are going to carry on the process, right? So that's kind of the leaderless aspect. And that gives rise also to a nice property of censorship resistance. If some of the leaders want to censor my transactions, they cannot selectively censor because the rest will help make the transactions. All right, so these are the design principles, and I'm going to show you now how the system works from a construction point of view, and then we can discuss kind of what properties it has and so on. There's a question. Yeah, that's I guess the talk is a little bit backward here. Like, I'm not starting with properties and then satisfying these properties, but I'm kind of starting with a motivation from Web 2 and then saying, okay, can we achieve this optimal latency? And I will go to what we are achieving because it's not trivial, actually. So I will get back to that, Marco. Thank you. Okay, so let's go through the kind of components of the construction. So we have the writer on the one hand. The writer is implemented pretty much in the obvious way. So the writer knows and connects to all the validators, all the replicas. And I will go back to the question of, okay, do I have to actually connect to everything? That's a question for a little bit later, but let's assume that we do. So what the writer does is it keeps active all the connections to all the replicas. Whenever it wants to make a transaction, it signs a transaction, broadcasts it to everybody. And when I say broadcast, I don't mean like reliable broadcast, like literally sends the transaction to everybody. And that's pretty much it, right? So, by the way, I've separated the writer clients and the reader clients, but literally these will likely be the same kind of wallet, right? That will be able to both receive and send payments, but just for simplicity of presentation, I'm splitting them up. Then in the middle, I have the replica, of which we have like n copies. And the honest replica performs a very simple process. What it does is it maintains a connection to all the clients. Okay, so that's happening all the time. And then as soon as it receives an incoming transaction from one of the writers, what it does is it appends it to a local log. And that log is a local copy that it only has, right? So it's its own opinion about what transactions happened in what order. And then what it appends is the transaction that it received together with a timestamp that it has based on its local clock. And for today's presentation, I will assume that all the clocks are perfectly synchronized, although you can get similar results with a little bit of discrepancy if you have a little bit of drift. Okay, and then what it does is, well, whenever it wants to push something to the readers, which is as soon as it receives a transaction, because we're making a streaming system, what it will do is it will sign with its secret key the whole log that it has and create a signature that it will push to the clients together with the log. Okay, and then by the way, this payload that is quite big, we will optimize it later to make it smaller as well. Okay, that's the honest replica. And then the reader, what it does is, well, it receives logs from all the replicas. And then what it does is it has a confirmation rule to tell it when a transaction is confirmed. And it will consider a transaction confirmed if 4/5 of the replica have signed that transaction in some position in their logs, although they may not all agree with what that position is. Okay, so that's kind of the construction, and obviously from exactly this number, as consensus experts, you are already seeing that my resilience is not going to be better than, you know, below n/5. So that's something that I'm willing to give up. I'm willing to give up the usual kind of 1/3 resilience to get this optimal latency. And now the obvious question is, you know, okay, I have this construction. What exactly does it achieve? What does it tell me when a transaction is actually confirmed, right? Okay. Lastly, one of the design principles was no communication between the replicas, right? So going back to that, that's kind of necessary to avoid additional latency, as I mentioned. But then this also induces a problem, right? It gives rise to a problem that, well, the logs of each replica might be different. And that's especially if my writer client is malicious and might send transactions to different replicas in different orders, for example, a double spend of sorts, right? Good. So does this actually achieve consensus, or can we modify it to achieve consensus, right? So let's go back to, well, I mean, there's a little bit of lingo here, but I will focus on the state machine replication problem, in which we're trying to achieve liveness and safety in the way that we know it. Okay, so for the liveness aspect, well, what the definition says is, if an honest transaction tries to be pushed, then it will eventually get confirmed, and this should be obvious that it's achieved, right? The confirmation happens very, very quickly, in fact, in optimal latency, as long as I have my resilience there. Okay, good. And then obviously the elephant in the room is, do I have safety in this? And the answer is, well, probably no, right? I don't have safety in the way that we're used to, but maybe I have something weaker. Okay, so let's remind ourselves, what is the traditional safety? So safety says, if you have two honest replicas and they report logs, so in the view maybe of two different clients or the same client, right? I have two different logs, L1 and L2, right, in the view of clients. And then these logs, what they should have as a property is that one is a prefix of another, or the other way around. So if these are my transactions, one of the logs is bigger, one of the logs is smaller, but the smaller log should be a prefix of the bigger one, right? So that's something I don't really have, exactly because, well, I'm not really, there's no really, I didn't even define to you how to make an order of transactions yet, right? So I just told you, just put a bunch of timestamps there, define a confirmation rule. Yeah. So this is something you don't have, especially because the replicas might see different transactions in different orders and they don't communicate. Okay, so clear. And by the way, we could not possibly achieve it in 2 delta latency in the way that I defined my latency from writer to reader. We have known impossibility results for this. So what do we achieve? Right. So what we're doing with these timestamps is that we're placing the timestamps in a sort of order, right? We're ordering the timestamps. And each client might see potentially a different bunch of timestamps. There are 4/5, so they might see a different sample. And by the way, we have an adversary who could also equivocate in timestamps, so they might see quite different things there. And the way that we place things in order in the view of one client is we take the median timestamp among the 4/5, right? So we place all the timestamps in order. Here I have 5 of them, and then I take the middle one, right? And that's where I place my transaction on let's say the timeline where each transaction happened. And so that gives me a very natural order which stems from the timestamps of each transaction. Okay, so here I've seen 4 transactions as one client, and I've placed them like this. And you can see actually the orange and the blue timestamps, some of them are in this order, right? And some of them are in this order. And in my view as a client, it happened that this one is here and this one is there. But if a different client gets a different bunch of timestamps, maybe from some different honest replicas or some equivocating adversarial replicas, they might place these transactions in a different order, right? So I don't really have the usual safety. Okay, but I do have something called generalized safety, and that property is the following. So consider one transaction, the orange one, as it is viewed by 2 different clients. These 2 different clients see a bunch of different timestamps, right? So some of them are matching, and some of them are different. And what they do is they extract a certain confirmation timestamp by taking the median. And the property that we have here is that the confirmation timestamp of one client is going to not exceed the maximum timestamp among the ones that another client has seen in one of the quorums, which is 4/5. Okay, so this is kind of the picture here. This client over here has assembled a quorum of timestamps, and then one of these timestamps is a maximum, which lies over here. Okay, and this gives me kind of this line. And then the other client has a median timestamp over here, that's over there, and the property that I want is that this thing is an upper bound for that thing, right? So I'm comparing the confirmation timestamp in the view of one client with the maximum timestamp in the view of the other client, and I'm saying that this cannot really exceed that. And also vice versa for the lower bound, right? So the minimum timestamp in the view of one client is a lower bound for the confirmation timestamp for the first client. Okay, so that's the generalized safety that I have. So that means that transactions can actually move around and change order a little bit in the view of different clients. However, they will not exceed these bounds. Okay, so that's the property that we have here. Let me do a proof sketch. So if you're consensus experts, maybe it already makes sense to you why this is true, but let's maybe go through it. So let's suppose that an adversary is trying to break this generalized safety, so break these upper and lower bounds for a particular transaction, this orange transaction. And then what happens is that the honest parties, which are there's 4/5 of, they've created certain signatures that I'm placing here in boxes, right? So you can imagine each of these boxes contains like a bunch of different timestamps, of which there are n/5 in each box. Okay, so that's 4/5. And they're spread out in time. The adversary can choose how to place them as they wish. Now, if the adversary wants two clients to differ in what they believe their timestamps to be, and one of them to have a confirmation that is pushed to one side, and one of them to have like a maximum that's pushed to the other side, what the adversary will do is they will try to create, well, a quorum for one client and a quorum for another client that are different. Okay, so to create a quorum and push that quorum to a timestamp that is towards the left, the adversary takes the three n/5 leftmost timestamps and then adds some adversarial votes even further towards the left. Okay, good. And that means that the client 1 now places the confirmation at this point, which is the median among these 4 n/5. Okay, but to cause a discrepancy, the adversary will now take the upper 3 n/5 votes and use them to convince the other client that the confirmation is going to be on the right side. And towards that purpose, the adversary will also equivocate and places some timestamps on the other side of the timestamps, right? So now what happens is that client 2 confirms there. Now let's compare what happens to the minimum and maximum between those two, right? So the maximum that this client sees in this kind of worst case scenario, worst case picture, is exactly the bound that happens to be on the median of client 2. So the maximum of client 1 is the median of client 2. And also vice versa, right? So the minimum here of client 2 is exactly coinciding with the median of client 1. Okay, so hopefully geometrically this picture makes a lot of sense. This is a sketch, obviously. There's a full proof in the paper that you can take a look at, but it should be pretty obvious how to carry it on formally. All right. And by the way, if I actually want to violate that property, I do need to exceed the resilience of 4/5. So I need a few more votes than 1/5, right? So if I'm the adversary, I need to push that transaction a little bit there, or push that transaction a little bit there. And so that gives me the accountability property, right? So any of these certificates that allow me to violate that property, if I take them together, then any observer that sees both of them has the equivocating votes and can hold me accountable. At least one-fifth of the population can be held accountable, right? So you have accountability kind of automatically here. Good. So that's kind of the construction. Those are kind of the properties that it achieves as a primitive. And then the question that I have also for you, it's kind of an open question that we're still working on, is what can we do with this? What is this primitive useful for? And we know that it's useful for certain things. For example, we can do payments with this thing. And if you've seen kind of literature that has appeared, okay, no. If you've seen literature that has recently appeared, or maybe not even so recently, like things like FastPay, things like Sui Lutris, also some of the papers that we will see today, right? They have many ideas that are trying to optimize latency and still do payments. So some of the constructions that we have, for example, for payments, are ideas that are similar to those. And then there's other things that we suspect we can do, like we can do auctions, we can do some voting on-chain, on pod, some sort of decentralized social where we can use it as a feed layer for people to post social content that needs a rough timestamp, but not precisely a timestamp, some sort of notarization for content and so on. We think these are good applications. We know that applications that are very strictly order dependent, like Uniswap, where just one transaction makes all the difference in the price, is this is not really a suitable primitive for that. And we also cannot run like full Turing complete smart contracts. However, kind of there is a big space between those two, and the question is, what is exactly the class of problems that we can execute on this system given this primitive? What is this useful for? So, given that we require optimal latency, what are the kind of programs that we can execute, right? So that's kind of a question that we're still exploring, and I'm putting it also out to the audience for food for thought. Good. A few comments that I left for last. Firstly, some of you might be suspicious that every client needs to connect to every replica. If you do want perfect latency, this ideal latency, you have to do it. But if you're willing to give up a little bit of latency, what you can do is you can use a sort of untrusted gateway in the middle that plays the role of connecting to all the replicas for you. So if you're familiar with Ethereum, this could be something like Alchemy. I push transactions to it, and then it is connected and responsible for pushing transactions to the replicas. And then if this thing is not acting correctly, so for example, it's harming my liveness, I can also be a reader on the other side and observe that my transaction is not making it, and then switch potentially a replica. And the price I have to pay is that there's a little bit of extra latency to switch, right? So that's something that you can choose to put in your design. And this can also be on the reading side, right? So I can put a replica on the reading side, and then it connects to all the replicas. It assembles all my signatures, maybe even aggregates a signature nicely so that the communication complexity is low, and then it pushes these things to the reading clients that only need one connection each. One last thing that's kind of cool, and this, by the way, is inspired by the creators of Merkle Mountain Ranges, the Googlers who created it, Emilia Kasper especially, when she created certificate transparency, she came up with some of these. So a lot of it is very inspired from traditional database systems and like distributed networking. So what you do here is you have a secondary, also untrusted. I've drawn it as a fatter box because it might need more resources, but it's untrusted. And then the replica is kind of thinner. It doesn't need too many resources, but it needs to be protected because it has a valuable private key. The design here is that each replica has one or more secondaries associated with it, and it replicates, in the traditional database sense of replication, every transaction that it signs into the secondary in a streaming fashion. So as soon as it signs, an append of a transaction to its own log, then pushes that transaction to the untrusted secondary. And then that secondary serves these read queries to reader clients. And the idea here is that we can use this to free up the resources of the replica. For example, the replica doesn't even need to hold its own log. It can even garbage collect historical transactions, just keep signing near the tip. Whereas the untrusted secondaries can maintain the whole log of their primary replica, and they can answer complex historical queries like what transactions happened within that range, some sort of predicate that does there exist a transaction that has the color blue, whatever kind of thing there, and then the replicas themselves can be very, very thin. And again, because they don't hold any keys, these can be replaced very easily. You don't need them to be trustworthy at all. So the whole picture would look something like this, right? So you have bunch of writing clients, bunch of reading clients. They use gateways so that they avoid multiple connections. And then there's the validators in the middle, the replicas in the middle. And then there's a second layer of secondaries. So these ones have like very lightweight hard drives and RAM and so on. But these ones keep fat hard drives and they can answer complex questions. And then lastly, each of the gateways connects to one secondary per replica, right? So that it can form a quorum, and then those quorums are potentially aggregated and forwarded to the clients, right? So it's a very much akin to traditional pictures that you would see in Web 2 databases. Yes, Marco?
What happens to your delta and optimal latency?
Yeah, so if you adopt right gateways, you automatically lose optimal latency, because, well, you have to do this round trip, and this might fail as well. If you want optimal latency, you have to kind of directly choose to connect to a replica, right? So this is a trade-off that you want to make. Like, if you want optimal latency, you have the option of directly connecting to a replica, but if you're willing to give it up and have fewer connections and just connect to one thing that is helping you without losing any sort of safety, but giving up a little bit on liveness, right? You can choose to use this architecture. So this is an opinion of the client, whether they want to go this way or that way. Same happens with the secondaries, right? If you want to use a secondary, well, you may want to introduce kind of an existential honesty assumption and have like 5 secondaries per replica, of which you assume 1 is honest and maintains a kind of good history, right? So the assumptions do change a little bit here. Yes?
Am I correct that there's an assumption here that if a client hears a timestamp from a good replica, the client will never hear like an earlier timestamp from that?
Yes, exactly. That is kind of implicit, but in the construction it is explicit. Yeah.
Then if you're doing that, how does that work with like secondaries, like aggregating signatures and stuff? Because the replicas might be chaining the transactions in different.
Right. So each replica maintains a sort of Merkle mountain range of transactions where the timestamps are ordered from left to right. So that gives you that full log. And then you're hashing them together to get the root here. And then what the replica is doing is every time it's appending a transaction to this Merkle mountain range, it also maintains this right slope, right? And then it can assemble those together into a hash here that it signs and sends to the secondary. And then the secondary can maintain the whole tree, whereas the replica itself can actually garbage collect everything that is below the right slope, so the memory requirements are really logarithmic for the replica.
But you said the secondaries can aggregate signatures. You said every replica would have a different.
Yeah. How do you aggregate signatures exactly is more complicated. You cannot do it exactly like that. So one way, for example, to aggregate signatures is the application itself can ask for a bit of leeway on the timestamps so that these can be like it can ask a question like not what is exactly your timestamp, but a question such as, was your timestamp before my deadline? And that can be something that the replica could potentially sign, and it can be a statement that is shared across the replicas and potentially aggregatable in, let's say, a BLS scheme. Right. Yeah. Or it could be like a smart contract. Well, not a fully Turing complete smart contract, but a sort of weaker smart contract that predicts these things. And it can go into, I guess, a lot of discussion here. But exactly, yeah. I mean, if you want BLS aggregatability, then the plain scheme does not really work. That's roughly it. So the key takeaways I have here is, we have this scheme. It achieves optimal latency by design. It's inspired by traditional databases, so it's quite a simple construction. And I think there's a lot of merit in borrowing what our predecessors have done in Web 2. We have certain applications that we believe it can do, payments for sure, auctions, voting, decentralized social, no general smart contracts. Open question for the audience, what stands in the middle there? What can we really execute with this thing? Can it be useful to you? Here's the paper, has a bunch of proofs. It also has like some analysis under crash faults that have better resiliences. And by the way, at Common Prefix, we're hiring both scientists and engineers, so if you're interested, ping us there. And with that, I'll take your questions.
Maybe I missed it, but are you assuming that the writer clients are honest?
No, you don't get, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So writer client sends a transaction to 3/5 of the.
Correct, yes. You can
1/5 the Byzantine makes reader client see 4/5.
Yes,
But other readers don't see anything.
correct, yes.
So
So none of these properties break.
but you said the safety was like, well, if I see this, then somebody. But you're in a situation where some people see something and other people don't see anything
Yeah, but well, the safety says, you know, if I see a quorum and you see a quorum, yeah,
I might see a quorum and you don't see a quorum at all.
that's possible. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, yeah. So what exactly, like, okay, there's a bunch of other properties, of course, which is like, okay, you know, do you have any guarantees that if one sees a quorum, then other people will see a quorum as well, all right? If you have a malicious client, not necessarily. You need a bit of echoing, either between the clients or the replicas to achieve that. So good catch. If you are honest, then you have certain liveness guarantees, right? Yeah, these like one of the tricky things is that these quorums can grow actually to be quite large if you have malicious replicas that are, you know, malicious clients that are writing with large time discrepancies, right? So then your guarantees can be quite varied. Yes. Yes.
It seems even for simple payments, you need to declare more dependencies than are normally in payments.
Exactly. So to do payments with that, you cannot just do it with like a FastPay-like construction, which I just get a confirmation. You need to have a way of saying, look, here is a valid certificate that the money I'm spending is valid, that I'm carrying on with my new payment, and that thing contains kind of its whole chain of money changing hands.
Because in particular, just because you have the aggregate amount isn't sufficient, because you could have something where like you're sending out like 5 payments, and you're hooking up funds for 4 of them to go out, but not all 5, and different subsets see different.
Yes. So the easiest way to analyze it is to use the UTXO model here to show that an output is actually unspent. And one kind of nuanced thing that you need here is a property that we call past perfection, in which if a client sees a certain timestamp, it knows that no new transactions will ever appear before that timestamp. So I know that I'm clear, you know, here's my universe of transactions that I might ever see before that timestamp. Nothing new will ever appear with a timestamp before that confirmed, even though a replica might vote for an earlier timestamp, right? So I believe so. I believe so. Yeah, we have a construction for payment specifically, but generally for UTXO, it's a conjecture. But I think so. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Because you do kind of a chain from Coinbase to whatever is the current state. Yeah, and then one question is, you know, how do you make that efficient communication-wise without sending the whole chain? Can you do some sort of maybe bisection game or a light client or, yeah, good question.